Well, welcome, Deborah Harkness. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much for agreeing to the interview with us at Syon House. So I'm Sarah Ponder. I'm one of the historic guides here at Syon, and we're absolutely, very excited about the new season of A Discovery of Witches, which was, absolutely huge on Sky, and the books as well. So especially Shadow of Night, which is featuring our very own Wizard Earl, the Ninth Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy, and the School of the Night, which, as you can see behind me, we've got our long gallery, and they would have, come here and talked about magic and alchemy and all sorts. So it's fantastic to actually see them come to life, if you like, in popular fiction, and to have them immortalized on TV. So we're really, really excited to see it. So we left season 1 and the first book, where Matthew and Diana time travel back to 1590 England, Elizabethan England. Syon House's link with the School of the Night starts a little bit later, when Henry Percy acquired the house in 1597. So it's a few years later, but he's very well ensconced, if you like, with his coterie of what I like to call math magicians, because
I like that. I'm going to steal that.
Oh, absolutely. And Henry himself is a real hero of mine. I recently finished my history BA, and I wrote my dissertation on Henry and that coterie of friends, and his, the patronage that he offered, and looked at what did I call it? It was lockdown learning, an Earl's Academy in the Tower. So it was the the kind of super group of tutors that he had for his son Algernon in the Tower of London when he was in prison there after 1605. But the School of the Night, having them here really at Syon is it's a real coup for us, we think, and we're hoping to see a bit more of them during the series. So what I'd like to ask, or start a few questions, why the School of the Night in the book, and also specifically why Henry?
All right, good questions all, and thank you so much for inviting me to this virtual audience at Syon House. I feel very much like I've been invited into this sacred ground, and it really is. For historians, I think Syon House really is sacred ground. I mean, it was definitely a very important space for intellectual free thinking and development, which was not always really supported in a university setting in the late 16th and early 17th century, right? So the curriculum had been established in the Middle Ages. It was very traditional. Mathematics and sciences, the quadrivium was still undervalued in comparison to the trivium. That had changed a little bit with Renaissance humanism. But if you were really a free thinker, if you were really pushing the intellectual envelope, you needed to find an alternative place to have those discussions. And so some of the places that we think, provided that were, workshops around the city. I mean, this is what I argued in my book, The Jewel House. Houses like Syon House, where a patron would gather essentially the precursor of an 18th century salon together. Yeah. And then, and the other place would have been the Inns of Court, the law schools, because they were much less regulated, and they were full of ambitious young men with time on their hands and money on their hands. So those are the sort of places where often the most interesting things happen. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, Syon House also there was a fire, correct? At Syon House?
Not not that I know of at Syon. Excuse me. It used to be an abbey. So it was an abbey. Yeah, it was an abbey from the 1420s up until the dissolution of the monastery.
Right.
Where the lovely Henry VIII decided to get rid of it. And he came to a sticky end, really, at Syon. So I don't know if you've heard the legend about Henry's body when it was on the way to Windsor to be buried. The progression went through on the road past Syon House. They developed a crack in the coffin, in the lead coffin. So they stopped at Syon House. It wasn't a house at that time. It was the remains of the cloisters and the
right.
It stayed there overnight until it was going to be fixed in the morning. And his body was 2 weeks old, 2 weeks dead by that time, and exploded, filled up with, gases, exploded and leaked out onto the floor. I hope you've had your breakfast. And dripped out onto the floor. When they came to fix the coffin the next morning, they had to shoo away dogs that were licking up his bits. So absolutely gorgeous.
I haven't heard that story, but I have heard similar stories. So that's very much in keeping with, they used to call it coffin liquor. That when the body would decompose inside, and then the liquid would seep out. Anybody who's a faint stomach, that the 16th century is not your period. But I have to go back to your question, which is why the School of Night? I got so distracted by Syon House. It's a very similar thing to you, where I did my master's thesis on the School of Night.
Oh, wow.
So I was at that point just a straight up Tudor Stuart historian. I got my master's in Tudor Stuart history, and I was interested even then in science, and I was interested in intellectual exchange and how we get at that, given the fact that there are so many silences surrounding it, right? If in a different time, if we had just sat down to have a chat about Henry Percy, I might not have taken notes. You might not have taken notes. It might have been the kind of conversation that would have, changed our intellectual outlook, but there wouldn't be a record of it. So I've always been interested in that and kind of intellectual community. And so I looked at the literature produced by the School of Night to try to figure out how they felt about Elizabeth and her power in the last 2.5 decades of her reign. So that last bit, because I was really interested in how these younger men who were sort of pushing the intellectual envelope dealt with an aging monarch. How did they sort of take the ideas? And so what I was really interested in was the combination of astrological, alchemical, poetic, etc. So that was, and George Chapman, who was a member of the School of the Night, wrote this amazing, very disturbing poem called The Shadow of Night. So that's, people always say to me, how do you come up with these great titles? I steal them from 16th century people almost inevitably. So that's how I became interested in the group. My thesis was mostly on Chapman, actually. But that's how I became interested in Matthew Royden, this kind of mysterious figure who then becomes Matthew Claremont in my novels. And this is one of the great joys about writing fiction is that as a historian, I can only argue what I have evidence for, direct, persuasive evidence. As a novelist, I can tell you what I really think based on circumstantial evidence that would never hold up to a historian. So people always say to me, what do you think your best work of history is? And honestly, in some ways, I think it's Shadow of Night.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Because I could really tell you what I thought.
Yeah.
Not what I could prove.
Yeah. And that's, I suppose, it's our interpretation of history You know, it's not just the evidence, the written evidence, because things are relationships and things are, you know, so much more complex than just a written record. And it's looking at them as humans and their emotions and the kind of conversations that they would have had. And even with diaries as well, you don't write down absolutely everything. So
Yeah.
the dialogue, the conversations that people would have, it really kind of comes to life in historical fiction, because, you know, you don't, there is that point where you think, oh, there's no evidence of it, but at the same time, you know, you have to show that they are human and you're not, you know, basing it just on the written evidence.
And that's where really Henry Percy is a bit of a challenge, because we do know so much more about him later.
Yes, yeah.
So if you think about it, you know, we know mostly about Henry Percy from 1600 on.
Yeah.
But if you think about how much you change over a decade.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Then we can't really just take the Henry Percy we know as a father,
yeah,
and as a prisoner, and move him back to 1590. We have to try to reverse engineer him in a bit. And Henry has always fascinated me, because he was head and shoulders the highest status of anyone in the group.
Yeah.
And yet he is a sort of, you know, I mean, Raleigh and Marlowe have all the star power.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely,
and yet, you know, I think, you know, hard to say, but I think, you know, either Marlowe or Harriet probably had the best intellects.
Yeah.
We know so little about Royden. You know, it's hard to say. We know he was a well regarded poet. But Percy is a real enigma. And so as I started doing research into him, you know, what became clear was the man had a bonkers family. His family is full of the most formidable characters.
Absolutely.
I mean, the grandmother really, I think, ate nails for breakfast. And that's why she shows up in the books, you know, with, you know, all of her instructions around Christmas. Because the one thing I could understand about him was he had a very strong grandmother in his life. And one of the things that absolutely intrigued me was the references here and there to the fact that he had hearing loss.
Yes. There was when you were kind of reading the description of Diana as she first meets him, and he's a gentle giant, and that's the kind of sense that I got from him from research, from him, as you know, for him as well. There's not many biographers, as you know, found yourself. There was Gordon Batho, and also you know, Gerald Brennan, you know, from much earlier, I think the 1920s, I think that was, but not a lot. It you know, it's really sad, because he is, like, you know, like you said, he's an amazing character. I like to think of him as, he really is almost like a keystone in that kind of age of scientific discovery, geographical discovery. You've got Raleigh and Harriet, who are very close with him. Harriet he's you know, in 1585, he's off to Roanoke, and, you know, Walter Raleigh. And then later on, you know, you've got the scientific revolution going on at the same time. It's just, he's got a finger in every pie. So he's a patron to these, you know, as I said before, mathematicians. He's a patron to all these, you know, all these new ideas coming out at the same time, and he's really at the crux of them, and he's funding it, which, you know, I find just amazing. I know in Shadow of Night, it's kind of, you know, that Matthew Royden is, you know, that his wealth that he's accumulated over the centuries, that, you know, is almost kind of indebted to him, or the other way around. But I find Henry Percy, you know, really just, you know, someone who's kind of changed the face of the world globally, you know, from the people in that small group of, you know, enlightened Renaissance men and women. The Queen herself, obviously Queen Elizabeth, she had John Dee in her ear, you know, all the time. Yeah. So it really was an exciting time, and he's right at the center of it, and he's, you know, bankrolling it in a way. Yeah. And if it wasn't for him, I mean, other patrons, you know, they did, you've got Shakespeare's patrons, you've got other artists' patrons, but this was very, very different. He treated them really as equals, I think.
Well, I think the difference is that he was really a patron practitioner. Mm. He's a little bit like Rudolph II in that, right? He's not just interested in it. He's actually doing it. And I think that gives you a very different kind of patronage power. But one of the things that really intrigued me was, you know, he was so often stumbling into plots. And he was so often sort of, weirdly, for a man of his status, he seems to have been sort of on the sidelines. So I took that little biographical nugget that he might have had hearing loss since a child.
Yeah.
And I tried to imagine what that would have been like in a culture where gossip and rumor and innuendo and inflection could literally get you killed.
Yeah.
And so in my story, one of the things I wanted to do was say, okay, well, you know, I always am playing though, okay, but what if that was true? You know, so people wouldn't have spoken much about a physical impairment like that in the period. So I take very seriously the mentions of it, because it's not the kind of thing you would have said lightly.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking, okay, this would explain so much about his career, the limits of his career, maybe why he did take a backseat to some of these other individuals, why he ends up in these, you know, being implicated in all these plots, because he literally, I can't even imagine if he was having in any way, shape, or form having to read lips to understand conversation, how you function at the court of Elizabeth. I don't get it. I mean, I think it's a miracle he did as well as he did. And so part of what I really wanted to do was, you know, I think sometimes we think of the past and we think everybody was whole and perfect and heterosexual and white and, you know, all these things. That's not the past, you know. And Henry Percy, I think, has something really important to say about disability and about how we think of it and about where we find it in the past and how it may have been covered up. So, you know, you sit and you look at that beautiful room and you imagine someone who might find it very difficult in a crowded court setting. And you can see why Syon House would have been so important to him.
Yeah.
Because he could have drawn in those scholars and academics and intellectuals that he really wanted to have a face-to-face conversation with. And he could have it, you know, it was patronage, but it was also a way for him probably to participate on a slightly more equal footing. He was on home ground, right? This was an environment he could control a little bit better. And so for Syon House to emerge with this kind of, you know, shimmery glow around it as this kind of place of intellectual exploration, I think makes absolutely perfect sense. You know, people say, well, you know, but was it really? And isn't this just, no, I think if Henry Percy, you know, if Henry Percy really had hearing loss
Yeah.
I think suddenly what is supposed to have happened at Syon makes so much more plausible sense, and also makes his position and role in it all the more important, I think, which is
And
great.
it's that, you know, as you said, being at court, you know, being a kind of gentle giant and being sort of shy, and that, you know, having the disability there, it's built, I think, on these face-to-face relationships that he has, and his strength of character in that way really, you know, really comes over. You could see how he, you know, reaches these heights and this well-respected point in his career and at court, because he has the ear of influential people, you know, absolutely as well.
Yeah, and I think that they were people who, they were his true friends. They did not see hearing loss as a sign of intellectual impediment.
Yeah.
And so we have a very troubling history as a species about seeing people who are differently abled as
Even
being somehow,
active.
as being somehow, I mean, you think about, you know, even so recently as the Queen's father, who had a stammer, and people used to think it meant that he was mentally impaired, right?
Yeah.
And so you met in the 16th century for a child who couldn't understand, who might be shy. These are signs that his mind perhaps is not up to the, his mind was perfectly fine. So to again, you know, to have that tight circle of friends who knew what his mental abilities were and did not mistake a hearing loss or a hearing impairment with anything intellectual, and knew that they could have these I mean, what a gift that must have been to them and to him. Yeah,
Absolutely. He from the research that I did for my dissertation, his upbringing, you know, and the Percy family themselves, you know, go back centuries, you know, coming over with William the Conqueror. I always kind of think, you know, with the whole sort of Game of Thrones thing as well, I always think that the Percys are the Starks, because they are, you know, they're in the north, they are guarding against the wildlings, who may be the Scots, and there's Hadrian's Wall. So it's that, you know, they're always very the king, you know, the king's in the north, and they always, you know, they've been that throughout. And then it was really when there were all these plots involving his father and grandfather and uncles, where the family went from being in royal favor and coming out of royal favor. I think that may have shaped his view towards being outcast and not being, you know, always popular. So, and also the humanist learnings that he's going through at the time, and looking at the potential of man himself rather than, you know, being kind of gifted it. It's building on your own abilities, and I think that was very much a humanist learning, and really shaped him, and also his family past, with, you know, being kind of up and down on that wheel of fortune, if you like.
I definitely think, like many of the great families, you know, the War of the Roses and Henry VIII were not necessarily hospitable to the enduring power of the great families. The Tudor dynasty is nothing if not insecure. Plantagenets were not nearly as insecure as the Tudors were, for good reason, you know. So, I mean, Henry really is the upstart. The Percys have got a way better pedigree than Henry does.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really sit well with Henry, you know? So, I mean, it's, you know, the fragility, I think we look back on it, we know that they eventually, everything was fine for the Tudors.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know that at the time. And so somebody like the Percys, that's hugely threatening. And I think that the fact that the Dudleys, the Percys, the Grey, the Greys, the Suffolk family,
absolutely.
It's just everybody thinks, well, if it worked for the Tudors, why shouldn't we get it? You know, so. But again, you kind of think to yourself, you know, imagine if that gentle giant of Henry Percy, if he had been perhaps really able to swim with sharks and had that kind of had the star power and ambitions of Raleigh with the Percy blood, we might be talking about a very different history of Britain.
Yes, absolutely.
Really, I mean, it's not too much to say that they're just, you know, he comes from a majorly important family, and a family that, you know, there's no sense in late medieval and early modern England that a rising tide lifts all boats. Instead, the philosophy is basically, you know, whoever dies with the most wins. It's definitely much more of an, you know, an accumulative kind of philosophy. So, you know, I think, you know, even Syon House these are Annex, Syon House, these are all symbols of success, physical symbols to remind people that, you know, of the power of the Percys. And it's why something like Algernon's education is so important, right? To kind of continue that legacy. So for me, you know, whenever a book is adapted, people have to go by the wayside, you know, characters, they can't possibly include everybody I can include within a book because of the budget. And when they said to me, you know, okay, the School of Night, it's really quite large. Who can we do without? The first thing I said was, well, you have to have Henry Percy.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm so glad you stuck up for him.
Right. So, you know, so poor George Chapman and Thomas Harriot may have hit the cutting room floor. But
I was about Thomas Harriot, I must say.
You know, because again, that's sort of 5 extremely expensive actors surrounding Matthew Good, and that's hard. That's a hard thing to achieve.
Absolutely.
But you know, I said you have to have Raleigh, and you have to have Marlowe, and you have to have Percy, and I'm so glad that I said that, because we were able to get an absolutely amazing actor, Adam Sklar, who himself has hearing loss, to play Harry Percy.
Oh, right. Oh, wow.
And it was such an education, because he and the actor who played Raleigh really had worked out a communication system on set that was about gestures and signals and cues that someone is talking. And I thought, I'm actually watching this, how the School of Night actually, how they thrived and survived. So you've got a lot to look forward to in Adam Sklar's representation of Henry Percy. And I think he's going to do the Percys proud with his representation.
I really am. It's just, you know, it's wonderful to be able to see him come to life, because to me he's a really important, you know, person in history that is really underrated or you know, is not known. And he's, you know, he's amazing. And you know what you were saying about the kind of disability and the diversity and understanding, you know, that, I mean, people don't know that he invited Pocahontas to come and live at Syon for 6 months. You know, it was just what, you know, an amazing man. So I'm just absolutely blown away that, you know, he features so heavily in Shadow of Night, and that he's going to be immortalized, you know, on TV. I will say that historic fiction is the gateway drug to academia. I know it certainly
Absolutely.
was for me. And, you know, I'm so thankful that you've, you know, included him in and made him such an important part of your stories. So thank you so much, Deborah, for that.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'm going to have to pop off to another call, but thank you so much for inviting me to join you at Syon House. And I hope one day to do so in person, but it is really, really a treat to think of Henry Percy walking those floors and those halls, and it's such a special treasure that we have it and that it can be visited. And I just hope everyone within the sound of my voice takes advantage of the opportunity to get to know a little bit more about this amazing historical figure, Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, the Wizard Earl, the mathematician.
Our lovely Wizard Earl, the mathematician. Yeah, we can have that. Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
With this series, and I'm looking forward to it in January.
Take care, and we'll all be watching.
Lovely.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.